The Apostle Paul is portraying the person of Jesus in terms of God's wisdom. Now, there's another passage in 1 Corinthians, now that Paul's already laid out his beliefs, he's laid out his Christology, we can approach a passage and we can start to see how it is that Paul interprets Jesus in light of God's wisdom. And that's 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, where Paul says that the rock that followed them was Christ. And he's talking about the Israelites in the wilderness experience. He says that they ate the spiritual food and they drank the spiritual drink and they were baptized into Moses. Clearly, Paul is using some sort of typology here to talk about the Lord's Supper, spiritual food, spiritual drink, and water baptism. They're baptized into Moses. And then he says that the rock that followed them, out of which they received the water, that rock was Christ. What does he mean by this? Does he mean that the anointed Messiah is actually a rock that was following them in the wilderness? That's not the impression you would get by reading Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But several Jewish writers contemporary to Paul, writing a little bit before Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, were saying that the rock in the wilderness was actually God's wisdom. And those Jewish authors are Sirach, Philo, and Wisdom of Solomon. I have an entire episode on this. If you want all the details, see episode 276 if you want all of those references. So what's Paul doing here? Paul is saying the rock that followed them was Christ. He is drawing on this interpretive Jewish way of understanding the rock in terms of God's wisdom. But the key thing is that a few verses later, Paul explicitly tells us that he is using typology. He says, I'm speaking to you in types. And then a few verses later, he says, I'm speaking to you typologically. So not just once, twice, Paul says that when I'm talking about being baptized into Moses, eating the spiritual food and drinking the spiritual drink, and that Jesus is a rock, he says, I'm talking to you typologically. So if Paul is drawing on this Jewish understanding that the rock was wisdom, and now Paul is saying typologically the rock is actually Christ, then we can see that the way that Paul understands his wisdom Christology is through typology. He tells us. And when Paul gives you the answers, you better get those questions right on the test. Okay? So the way that Paul understands Christ in the present and wisdom in the past is through typology. Wisdom is going to function as the prototype, and Christ is going to function as the antitype. We know that Paul uses typology in other places. Paul has an Adam Christology quite clearly, where Adam is the prototype human being and Christ is the antitype human being. So if Paul tells us he's using typology to understand Jesus in terms of God's wisdom, we need to take that very seriously.